Asian American Alliance of Marin. I'm honored to join all of you for this annual. I wish we could be with you in person. In early 2020, when I first heard about COVID, I was actually really immediately concerned because if you recall SARS, Asians were shunned and avoided. And I knew, because I teach Asian Americans history, that whenever diseases came from Asia, Asians oftentimes were scapegoated for those diseases, those epidemics. They were then met with violence and met with racist policies. And I was really concerned that that would happen again. And so I began to track the news accounts of what was happening, and it was a global trend of racism. Early on in Australia, a Chinese person died on the streets because no one would help him because they thought he had coronavirus when he was having a heart attack. And so I heard about these news accounts. I began to track and saw a clear trend that Asians across the world were getting attacked. And in the United States, the trend was also apparent in our news accounts. So we contacted our Assembly General at the time to say, can you start collecting data to document what's happening? Government, I felt, should safeguard the safety and public health of its communities. That Attorney General said they didn't have the capacity. So I began to work with Chinese Affirmative Action in San Francisco and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council in LA to create our own website. It's here, Stop AAPI Hate. And we launched it in March in 5 different languages. Now it has 13. So we launched in March 2020. And immediately we were inundated with hundreds of stories from Asian Americans across the nation about how they were being attacked, how they were facing virulent racism, and how dangerous the hate was. It was horrific. And we continue to this day to get reports in the thousands. And so to give you a sense of what's happening nationwide, I'm going to share with you stories that happened in Marin. And I want you to put yourself in these person's shoes. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat some of the words that you feel as you experience it. So if you were to experience these stories, what are the words that you feel? So I'm going to invite Mark and Nancy to read them alternatingly.
I was emptying my trash into a public trash can at a rest stop, and a white male of about 30 years old walked towards me. He asked me where my mask was, shoved me back, and said, "If anyone should be wearing a mask, it is people like you." He mocked me by pulling his eyes back to resemble slant eyes and bowed to me. Larkspur, California.
We were waiting in line to get vaccinated. A man walks by our car and yells, "Effing chinks." Larkspur, California.
On my daily walk in my hometown wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" when she passed me. I was stunned by her words, and this caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings. Sausalito.
Old man yelled at my son and said, "Effing Chinese people bringing all the diseases here." Novato, California.
I was in a staff meeting and the facilitator asked us to raise our hands if we have heard of coronavirus. I misunderstood the question and asked, "What? Are you asking who has it?" And then a white colleague joked, "You have it." Later, she came and apologized for making that joke, noticing that I am Asian, and she thought it wasn't funny after all. Sausalito.
I was visiting an upstairs neighbor who was not home in a 55-plus community of condos. I was verbally accosted by another neighbor who said, "You have no business upstairs. There's nothing for you upstairs. You stick to your own kind. You can only talk to your Asian neighbor. You have no place here." Novato, California.
As I was walking out of the post office, a white male in his mid-50s to 60s passed me as he was walking in and said, "Effing you, Chinese virus," while looking down. He made sure no one was around and said it so no one else could hear it. Novato. I
was on my bike climbing a winding stretch of road where cars slow, waiting to pass cyclists. From the passing car, a young man shouted, "F you, foreigner, get a car. I am a white male born in the US. I was wearing a cycling jersey that had Japanese kanji characters on its back. along with a Japanese flag. The man thought I was Asian. Mill Valley, California.
Okay, thanks. So if you could put in the chat some of a few words of how you're responding to this emotionally. I see horrific, grieved, exhausted, not surprised, sad, stunned, sad, horrified, angry, sad, misdirected anger, disappointed, shocked, sad, appalled, not surprised. I feel attacked myself. Punch in the stomach and beyond sad, horrified, disgusted, ignorant. So I think you can understand, these are just Marin County incidents, but this is happening nationwide. So I think you can understand how I think the Asian American community overall is feeling distressed and saddened, angered and appalled, isolated and fearful. I'm arguing that this is actually a period of collective racial trauma. It's actually akin to Japanese American incarceration, not in that the situation is the same, but the trauma experience will have similar effects. We're going to be long-term. It's going to be intergenerational. It's collective in that so many people are experiencing it. And like that person said in the chat, it could be me. Even if you weren't personally directed with racism, when you one of the news attacked, you could feel for your elders, or you may say that could have happened to me. So it's collective. It's racial because, like this last incident, this white person was attacked because they thought he was Asian. And it's traumatizing because, again, we're experiencing these attacks and you can't dismiss them. You can't avoid those feelings, the mental health issues of anxiety and depression, of avoidance and hypervigilance. So I'm going to share a little bit more about the data next. Stop AAPI Hate, we've received 9,000 incidents through the summer of racism, and this is just a fraction of what's happening. Another survey says that 1 out of 5 Asian Americans this past year experienced direct hate. That's over 4.5 million cases of racism. They fall under 4 main categories. Here on the bottom, civil rights violations make up about 11% of the cases. We're mistreated at the workplace, denied service. Online harassment makes up 8% of the cases, but we know that young people who are on their screens a lot more report much higher rates of cyber racism. 70% of our young people say they've seen something offensive or racist in the last month. Microaggressions like harassment or shunning make up the bulk of our incidents. But as you read, they're not micro, they're actually traumatizing with lasting effects. 1 out of 5 Stop AAPI Hate respondents now report racial trauma. That's diagnosed 3 or more long-term symptoms of issues like anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, where you're really worried, constantly looking out, mistrusting people, and avoidance. So that's why I say this is a traumatizing period. And finally, we're getting physically assaulted. We're getting coughed and spat upon so often that we created a special checkoff category just so that people could more easily identify what happened to them. My own wife was running in Oakland and someone blocked her path and just coughed in her face. A person in New England coughed on groceries and then coughed on the cashier, and he was arrested for terrorism, for domestic terrorism, because it is a public health threat. You can argue that it's happening so much to Asians that we are experiencing mass terrorism. And finally, hate crimes, or what can be considered a hate crime, make up about 14% of the cases. We're getting pushed and shoved. Our elders are having bottles and rocks thrown at them. People try to run us over with their cars. You saw the hate and the anger directed to us, the verbal attacks, coupled with so much assault. I wasn't surprised that this year in San Francisco and Oakland and New York, elders have been killed, sadly. I wasn't surprised by the Atlanta shootings. In fact, we were actually preparing for a case like a mass shooting. The trends have also been consistent. Bullies attack those whom they think they can bully. So women are attacked twice as much as men, and young people and elders are disproportionately targeted. And overall, these are cases of racial profiling. Even though China is blamed for the disease, people who simply look Chinese are being attacked. So if you're East Asian, you're more to be attacked. Groups like Japanese, Vietnamese, Koreans, Filipinos are being attacked. In LA, an indigenous person, no, in LA, a Latino person was punched and told to go back to China. And in Vancouver, an indigenous person was attacked and told to go back to China. So the question for me is that all of these incidents raises, why now? This is simply a biological virus. Why is there so much of a surge in racism against Asian Americans? And I think there's three reasons, three main factors that's been fomenting the hate beyond the fear of the pandemic. So the first main problem, or the main factor, is the political rhetoric. And again, it's nonpartisan. Both parties are making anti-China rhetoric part of their agenda, and China bashing then leads to the bashing of Chinese people. But President Trump's use of the term, his insistence of the term Chinese virus, was really, really deadly. It did two things. It racialized a biological virus so that the virus became Chinese, and then it stigmatized the people so that Chinese people were the ones who carried the disease. That connection, that the virus is Chinese and that Chinese people have the virus, became part of people's thinking. It became part of their racial schema, we call it. It became their implicit bias. Eventually, when they heard that term over and over again, and then when they saw that term sort of reinforced in the media and in social media, that association actually gets chemically hardwired in our brains so that we make these automatic assumptions. We have this implicit bias that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus. This is a viral post, an Instagram post, where university students were having a coronavirus party. They were drinking Corona beer with pictures of Chinese people with masks on all around them. You can see how racist it is. You know, it shows that we're rat eaters. And some of the pictures even had Chinese with their eyes X'd out as if they died. And this is how American university students are partying. This is another viral post, the supposed source of the disease, Chinese people eating bats. So when you hear that term, Chinese virus, and that term did go viral and led to hate violence, when you hear that term and when you see media representations over and over again, it becomes part of how we view the virus and how we see Chinese people. It's part, again, of our schema. Schema works so that we make automatic responses in face of threats. For example, if you see a growling dog, you don't stop and pause and think its teeth are bared, it's growling, it looks angry. You make an automatic response and you go into fight or flight response. And in the same way, when people were afraid of the pandemic and already on edge, and then when they saw an Asian person, I argue that they were triggered, they felt threatened, they make that association, that person has a virus, and then others would go into fight or flight response against Asians. So we're not saying everybody's intentionally racist, but we are saying that people are using racial lenses to understand the disease and racial lenses to view Asian people. Even I had that implicit bias. If I saw a Chinese person wearing a mask early in the pandemic when people weren't wearing masks, I would think that person's probably more likely to be diseased than a non-Asian. We all have these stereotypes. We all have these fears that operate. We all make automatic responses because it's actually evolutionarily how our neuropsychology works. So again, that term Chinese virus stigmatized the people and it made the virus racial. So this fear that people had of Asians that was being triggered harkens to the third factor that causes the racism, and that's the yellow peril stereotype. And probably most of you know about this. This is the stereotype that Asians are a threat to the West, that we're dangerous coming from the East to overcome the West with our hordes of people and with our disease-ridden bodies. This yellow peril fear, this stereotype that we were disease-ridden, this stereotype that we're going to take over, has been invoked time and time again by politicians, both to justify racism and racist attacks and to legitimate racist policies. And let me give you a couple of historical examples of how this yellow peril stereotype has been invoked. In the 19th century, as you see in this picture, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were seen or represented as specters of death emanating out of San Francisco Chinatown. This yellow peril fear of Asians and their diseases, the threat of Chinese people stealing white workers' jobs, and the notion that we're heathen, coolie, unassimilable pagans all led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first legislation that excluded an entire group and became the basis for subsequent racism later on, racist policies. At the same time, in the 19th century, over 200 Chinese settlements along the West Coast were actually forcibly driven out. These weren't just individual lynchings, these were entire communities expelled by mass displacement, by mob violence. My own family, my great-grandparents settled in Monterey in the 1860s, right across from the Monterey Aquarium. They lived there for 4 decades until finally the landlord evicted them in the height of this anti-Chinese sentiment. When the Chinese wouldn't leave, he told the property manager the Chinese have to go by any means necessary. That was what the telegram said. And a week later, a fire burned down the village. Newspapers said that crowds came and cheered. The landlord then bulldozed the rest of the village into the ocean and fenced off the area so that the Chinese couldn't return. So my great-grandparents, who lived there for 4 decades, raised a family, had a home, had a thriving business, and that immigration record said my great-grandfather had the largest shipping business in the area. They had to move to San Francisco, Chinatown, pretty much penniless. And it would take my family 2 generations to be able to become property owners again. San Francisco was the only place of refuge that they could go to. But in 1900, the bubonic plague was found. And again, history repeated itself. Chinese were blamed. And so they segregated the area, quarantined the area, and you could see Chinese were kept cordoned off with police guards around the perimeter, presumably to be left getting sick. Whites were allowed to leave. In Santa Ana and Honolulu, the Chinatowns were actually burned down and left thousands of Chinese people homeless. So this Chronicle article says the bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. A disease comes, Chinese get blamed, Chinese face violence, and they face racist policies. That connection continued on Angel Island, and probably a lot of you know about, well, you see Angel Island from where you are in Marin. When Europeans came through Ellis Island, they were processed within 2 or 3 hours and then allowed to disembark. On the other hand, Chinese and then later Asians coming through Angel Island were actually mass detained for long periods of time, at least weeks. Because Chinese were suspected as a yellow peril, they were seen as illegal, they were seen as being disease-ridden. They had to go through the lengthy interrogations that you may know about and thorough health checks. 5% of the Chinese were actually deported because they didn't meet arbitrary health standards like being free from roundworms or hookworm. Their need to get here spent their family fortunes, but they never made it to San Francisco because they were deemed medically unfit. And so the poet, this is that the poems on Angel Island write of the violence and write of the racism and the injustices of the Chinese experience and how they thought it was unfair. And actually how shamed they were to, especially for the women, to be stripped naked and checked in those ways. Later on in the 1940s, tuberculosis was an epidemic in California. Latinos and Asians were more disproportionately impacted. And it was because of environmental racism. Asians were segregated by law and had to live in more crowded, squalid conditions. So both sides of my family, my mom's side in LA, my dad's side in San Francisco, they both had tuberculosis and they were both sent to sanatoriums. And because of health policy at the time, children were separated from their parents. And my aunt speaks of how she was 2 or 3 and she would run around, but because the cure for tuberculosis was bed rest, they actually strapped her down for hours, actually all day. So you could hear just from my family story, because of race and because of health policy, my own family experienced exclusion, quarantine, segregation, detention, deportation, and long-term family separation. That's been our history. And I want to talk about how Asian Americans are racialized and treated today. Now, last year, when we saw George Floyd murdered in Minnesota, Asian Americans were horrified. They were, like the rest of America, really saddened by the tragic killing of George Floyd. But we were also put into an identity crisis because we saw at the scene an Asian police officer holding back the crowds while Derek Chauvin was choking George Floyd. And because we're Asian, we don't distance ourselves from him and say, oh, he's just an individual. But we know that other people see us in him, and when people see him, they see us. We're lumped together. We can't distance ourselves. So I know I had to wonder, wow, are Asians complicit with white supremacy, or are we really in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? right? That's the issue. Where do we fit in America's racial hierarchy? And so as we're wondering whose side are we on, we had to also acknowledge we are neither white nor black. Instead, we're often invisible. We're omitted from racial discussions. When people talk about racial history or have talks about racial politics or even talking about minorities, Asians are often omitted, invisible, unheard. And so within this white-black binary, we feel invisible and unheard. And then because of the racism, we realize, no, Asians are racialized. We are actually sometimes invisible, other times we're hyper visible, and we're seen in different ways. And we're perceived on whether we're insiders to America or outside America. On the inside, we're seen as belonging. We're crazy rich Asians. We're the minority that other groups should emulate. But that status is really conditional. You heard about Suni Lee, the gold medalist, the gymnast. She was just pepper sprayed. Here is a person who represented America, won a gold medal for America, but she was perceived as an outsider and pepper sprayed. So our status of really being seen as Americans is really, really fungible. In times of war, such as World War II, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, or after 9/11, when South Asia's Muslims and Arabs faced Islamophobia, in times of economic down, such as when Vincent Chin, a Chinese person, was killed because he was mistaken for being Japanese, and white auto workers blamed Japan for their economic distress. And in times of pandemic, Asians are more portrayed, more seen as foreigners, the yellow peril, outsiders to be excluded. And last year, we had all those three conditions. We had the US-China Cold War, we had the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we had COVID-19, leading to all this sort of hysteria and anger that gets directed towards us as foreigners. In half our incidents, people say things like, go back to China, you effing chink, you read it. People were saying that in Nevada, right? Because we're being treated as foreigners, you know how America treats foreigners. We build walls against them. We think it's legal to separate the families of foreigners. And apparently Asians seen as foreigners can be spat or coughed upon. If you're an elder, you could be pushed or shoved. They're not pushing our grandparents because they're so smart as a model minority. They're pushing grandma because they think she doesn't belong to this nation or she doesn't belong to the neighborhood. So I think this stereotype that we're outsiders, the yellow peril, to be excluded, is much more operative now. And I think that we are actually not racialized the same way as Blacks, but I see ourselves in line with Black Lives Matter in solidarity, that we're both trying to dismantle systems that stereotype us, systems that hold us down. You could see this insider-outsider dynamic when you think about how Asian American women are portrayed. And Natalie's poetry really spoke to this. If we're seen as insiders, then Asian women are often portrayed as China dolls, quiet, docile, appropriate for the white male gaze. But if they're portrayed as outsiders, they're seen as dragon ladies, threatening, hypersexualized. Either way, whether on the inside or outside, they're still objectified. They're not fully human. And because they're not fully human, they're treated like objects or sexual beings. And that's why I think in the Atlanta shootings, the guy said he had a sexual addiction. He could have, gone anywhere, but he drove out of his way to attack Asian businesses. And he went out of his way to shoot Asian women. And I think this representation of Asian women contributed to that. So the yellow peril has been re-invoked, history has repeated itself, and the impact of the racism has been violent and deadly. But there have been other adverse impacts as well. Among the worst mental health distress of any group during the pandemic, and those who experience racism have higher rates of stress, anxiety, and somatic symptoms. Here's my takeaway fact, data point. When asked, what's your greatest stressor during the pandemic? Asian Americans overwhelmingly say racism. But think about that. Asian Americans are more fearful of other Americans' hate than we are of a pandemic that's killed 700,000 people. I'll say it again to underscore. Asian Americans are more afraid of racism and other Americans' hate than we are of a disease that has wiped out a population the size of San Francisco. That's how widespread the racism is. That's how traumatizing it is. That's how fearful we are about our elders. That's how deadly it is. You could put on a mask against COVID-19. You can't vaccinate yourself from some random stranger who pushes your grandmother. And so we're in a heightened state of anxiety and fear. Because of racism, our economies have been impacted. People thought they could catch the disease at Chinese restaurants, at Vietnamese nail salons, so they avoided us. And so those businesses had to close and they had to lay off large swaths of Asian American working class. I don't have the stat here, but 83% of Asian Americans with a high school degree or less, those who work in the service sector, filed for unemployment this past year. 83%. That's compared to 37% of other Californians with similar educational attainment. Our rates of unemployment are 2.5 times that of others in California. Straight causal relationship. Racism is impacting our employment status. And racism has led to racist policies. Last year, the administration banned Chinese scientists and researchers and then suspended migration visas so that families couldn't reunite. He cut refugee resettlement. He cut H-1B visas for professionals. All these policies disproportionately hurt Asians and actually viewed Asians again as the yellow peril. We were excluded. This was like this second Chinese Exclusion Act. We were excluded for being national security threats, economic threats, and public health threats. So history has repeated itself. Diseases come, Asians blamed, Asians attacked, Asians faced racist policies. But there's one last part of the pattern that's continued. In all those historic cases, Asians have always resisted. We're not hapless victims to discrimination, but we've always fought back. And today we're fighting back yet again. Our youth have really stood up. Last year, we put a call out, and within 1 week, we gathered 100 youth who spent their summers fighting hate. They interviewed 1,000 of their peers and wrote their own policy report. That policy report became the basis for Congresswoman Grace Meng's legislation to fund ethnic studies. So you can see here this headline that across the nation that people are now pushing for ethnic studies. I really love this picture. Just last week, I met these students. They're middle school students in Berkeley. They organized a rally of 1,200 people, and they too are calling for ethnic studies. Our influencers are really sounding the alarm. When people weren't addressing the issue, we used alternative media, social media to get the word out. And because those messages went viral, finally mainstream media began to pay attention to us. Finally, the government began to listen to us. And you know how I said that people were going into fight or flight response when they saw Asians, that they were triggered by Asians? I think in the same way, Asians are also feeling threatened, and we are getting triggered by racism, that we're going to flight or fight response in response to racism. The fight response is Chinese are calling, or Asians are beginning to arm themselves. They're giving their kids mace. They're calling for more policing. The flight response is we're the racial group that is least likely to send our kids back to the classroom in person for fear of the pandemic and bullying on the way to school or bullying at school. I don't know any Asians who haven't told their elders to stay inside. That's the flight response. But there's a third response I think is really adaptive, a third response to the threat of racism that's actually really healing. And beyond fight or flight, I see Asians flocking. We're flocking back at vigils after Atlanta and Indianapolis shootings to grieve and find solace with one another. We're flocking at these rallies to gain support and build allies. We're flocking back to our ethnic businesses that are depressed to provide support. We're flocking to chaperone our elders. We're flocking tonight with AAAM. And I think by flocking, we've been able to make a change. By flocking, we've been able to make our voices heard. By flocking, we're able to fly. And we have been able to make change. Stop AAPI Hate is more oriented towards policy change that's institutionalized, that's more long-term. Senate was passed a hate crimes bill 94-1, which is amazing considering the political polarization of our Congress. President Biden has issued a couple of executive orders addressing anti-Asian hate. And in California, we have approved an API equity budget of $156 million. This is historic. California has finally recognized Asians face racism. Asian Americans faced historic inequities that impacted our health, mental health, education, and public safety. So I think this is really a model for the rest of the nation. We can't just denounce racism or hashtag it. We have to put our money where our mouth is and actually fund community groups to resist it. So to conclude, I talked about how Asian Americans were thrown in an identity crisis, that we don't know where we belong in America's racial hierarchy, or we don't even feel accepted by America. And what I tell my students is that, you know what, I don't really want to belong to America as it was. I don't want to belong to a society that mass incarcerates, mass detains, mass shoots Asians. But now's our chance to dream and to come out of the pandemic and build towards a nation that I do want to belong to, an America that I do want to belong to, a nation that doesn't have that white-black hierarchy, a nation that doesn't have insiders or outsiders, a nation that even if you are a foreigner, you're treated with respect and dignity. I want to belong to a nation that's actually more Asian, where we respect our elders and we can walk the streets safely and take care of one another. So I'd just like to thank you for joining with me today, for flocking with me and helping me reimagine an America that we do want to belong to. Thanks. No, I've heard of the term Han supremacy, which I think is actually pretty operative. Yeah, this sort of ethnocentrism of Chinese people, but I think like every group has that sort of ethnocentric view that they're the best or they're, superior. It is basically the model minority stereotype that Asians have made it and don't need any help because it really masks all the issues that we do face, the racism that we're experiencing. People often say, oh, they're just ignorant people, but the danger is then like a lot of America then is ignorant, apparently, right? And so I don't want to just blame individuals for their ignorance. I want to blame the system, the institutions that make them not more educated, right? I blame the system for politicians who foment and actually spread the racism. So our aim at Stop AAPI Hate isn't just to try to make people more educated, it's to change the system that doesn't educate people to treat each other with respect, to change the system that creates people that spit on each other, right? What kind of society does that? But that's our society. And it's not just a bunch of individuals, it's our society that's creating a whole group of people who do that to others. And so the hope is that we don't just change it individual by individual who are ignorant, but we change a system so that we better educate, a system so that we better promote respect and dignity. So it's sort of both and. On the individual interpersonal level, we got to stop racism, we have to intervene, but really on the institutional structural, we have to change policies that these inequities are addressed, these policies get rectified. There was a survey done, and 45% of Americans couldn't name a famous Asian American. They couldn't name anybody, even though our vice president is Asian American, 45% of America. And then they named Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee. And Jackie Chan isn't an Asian American, and Bruce Lee is dead. Most people are really segregated. They haven't really met other Asians. And what they know about Asians is from popular media, right? And from Hollywood. And so I think, yeah, eventually as people get to know each other and have contact with each other, that's how you dispel prejudice. And but that's why they integrated schools, but schools are actually more segregated now than they were in the 70s and 80s. But even though our country has become more diverse, it's become even more segregated, ironically. One of Stop AAPI Hate's top priorities moving forward is to educate, and we're really promoting ethnic studies curriculum K through 12. California just passed it, and they're requiring it as a high school requirement to take a class. Illinois passed it, and they have to include a unit in to pass high school. Connecticut is proposing it, and there's 5 other states that are proposing ethnic studies. So we're going to really work with those states to get it passed. We're going to work with California to see the full implementation. Research shows that even if you have the curriculum, you need teacher training so that teachers really know how to teach it well, right? So you could have the best curriculum, but if teachers don't know how to teach it, it's sort of useless. And then good teachers could teach almost anything with no curriculum, apparently. But yeah, so we're really going to push ethnic studies. And our other priority areas beyond pushing for ethnic studies, we're going to really try to expand the civil rights. Again, not everything is a hate crime, but a lot of the cases where we get harassed in stores and can't shop, that's a denial of our public accommodations. That's our denial of safe access to goods and services. In California, we have better civil rights protections than the rest of the country. So you can actually file a claim in California if you get harassed in a store, and they'll even provide bilingual mediation. California is pretty good. It's just nobody knows about this, and so we're working with them to publicize the rights we have and to get people to use those services. Well, I don't know. Hopefully, we'll come up. I thought we're in the news as much as we can. Again, news tries to capture what's new and marketable and captures full attention. So Asians face violence, are attacked, but just numbers doesn't impact them. They need the numbers plus the video footage. So we're going to come out with a report next week, another national report, and we'll see if that gets any news. We're going to put out an elder report about how elders are impacted and see if that captures. In 2016, this is a national survey, 52% of Americans didn't believe Asian Americans experienced racism. Over half the nation, they thought we were white. Mm-hmm. In 2021, 9% of Americans think we don't experience racism. So we've been able to show, at least this past year through Stop AAPI Hate and others, we've been able to change the thinking of half of America that Asian Americans do experience racism. So that's actually, it's not great news, but it's a higher awareness of our concerns and our issues. So I think the movement has been global. I don't know if you go, the K-pop group BTS, they tweeted Stop AAPI Hate, and that was the top trending tweet in the world a couple of months ago. So that's how I know, that's my measuring stick of if we made it. But when we do issue news, it gets out on national levels. So I think we're getting more attention than we had before. But the only reason we get coverage is almost everybody who interviews me is Asian American. Only Asian American journalists are the ones who cover it, or they get assigned to me. Otherwise, it doesn't get the attention. The strategy we use is you get resolutions, because nobody's going to be against a resolution and say, have the county denounce the racism, have the county apologize, and then set up a committee to make reparations, have the county do something to examine inequities that Asian Americans face. And the resolution process, it's symbolic, so nobody cares usually. And then, but it opens the door. It's the foot in the door approach. And the same way we've been doing the same thing with ethnic studies, have school boards introduce resolutions saying we should study the issue. But once you start studying the issue, it gets the ball rolling, it gets committees formed to actually act on it. And then once you have that momentum, then it's sort of, institutions don't like to have wasted their time. I mean, that's how Japanese Americans got redress and reparations. They have the Committee of Wartime Relocation and Redress that went around, documented the racism, and then they were able to get reparations. In the same way, Stop AAPI Hate, we document what's happening, and then we have to do something. So if Marin County could document what Asians are experiencing, could pass resolutions, that's for me the first step. It's a long process, but that's our strategy of getting our foot in the door, especially if you don't have that many Asians in the government. But so, the only reasons why Illinois, Connecticut, and California passed ethics studies is that they had Asian American elected officials, right? It's just like the only reason why we get news in the news is because we have Asian American journalists. The only way we got Asian American studies is because we had Asian American elected officials.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Russell, that in May, during Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, our board did pass a resolution denouncing the hate against the Asian American community. And a lot of the Asian American Pacific Islander employees in the county did speak during that item. And it was a very powerful time because it was also a very vulnerable time to share some deep experiences, but it seems to have just been a moment in time. And so versus something more longstanding, because I think the myth of the model minority is strong. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, that our issues are masked, that we don't have the same problems that others do. So I think, again, it is by the flocking and the organizing, have the Asian American Alliance work with the employees group, right, to sponsor another resolution, maybe at some historic time, an anniversary or something, to take the next steps and say, okay, we've denounced the racism, so let's take the next steps. I mean, that's what we're calling for in the apologies. It's like, get your cities to apologize, you apologize, then you call for reparations. And so it's a sort of, for me, a step-by-step basis. On the individual level, I think like working with this organization is really helpful. You got to keep on banding together, and maybe this group could propose resolutions and legislation. I think both at the school level, kids are facing bullying. You could have more mental health services. You could make sure that the curriculum includes Asians. You know, like we talked about, we want our children to be educated to prevent the racism. So even encouraging local school boards to include curriculum. You could do public awareness campaigns that are effective too. Things like greet your elders, or encourage people to respect people of all ethnicities face. And so that type of neighborhood campaign promotes a sense of safety and security, especially if it's in different languages. So I'm really concerned about our elders coming out, but that's on the interpersonal level. Again, voting in Asian American or politicians who fight for justice. In California, it's a lot better. Oh, and then you could, again, support Asian businesses that have been hurt a lot too, right? So that's the easy way. My big thing is, again, to support the elders. Our elders are really afraid to go out. So they really do need their families to take them out. And then, you know, by going out with, they'll do anything for their grandkids. This is my sort of suspicion. Get your grandkids to take the grandparents out, and then get them used to going out into the public again. It's really weird, you know, and it's hard. And so check on the well-being of everybody, but especially our elders, because they trust their family the most. They're more likely to go see their family the most. And that's another big recommendation from our elder report. Push your kids as much as you push them to be doctors. And I don't know. I think it's sort of the same way. How do you convince someone on the different political side to come at least to understand your position? How do you have real conversations with people who have different political views, or conversations? And so what you want to do is share your own story and make them feel your pain, your emotions, your heart for politics, your heart for policies, your heart for a society that's better. And when people hear your story, when you tell the stories, you move people's hearts. And that's the best way, is to connect people heart to heart by sharing your story, your feelings. And your kids aren't gonna say, "Mom, you're screwed up." They're gonna feel for their mom, right? And that actually creates dissonance, because they go, "I don't care about politics, but my mom, she was really hurt by this policy," right? And then when people face that dissonance, and when they feel connected to you, then later on, it creates that distance that actually does move people more towards your side. Actually, Gene, I keep on thinking about your question. How do you get your daughter to become a politician? I have to think, this is how all Asian parents, you just nag, and then you guilt. And then if you're an immigrant, you say, "I came all this way for you to have an opportunity to get elected." And so use that parenting skills that Asian moms have, and just use obligation and guilt and shame, and say, "Your cousins are running for office, why don't you?" I think that'll work. It's natural for immigrant parents, especially, to have fears, right? They're new to the country, they came for security, they came for the American dream. And so they want you to do well. And because they don't know the system, they have all these fears. And so they just want you to do what they see every other Asian doing, which is to go to school and become an engineer or doctor or whatever. If you want to do something different, then they're going to be afraid, and that's going to trigger them, and they're going to go to flight or fight response. I'm really big on flight response these days. So you have to show them that you have a plan, that you know what you're doing. You have to show them that you're trustworthy. and you say, I want to just try this for 2 or 3 years, and I know what I'm doing, and here's my plan. And as much as possible, that helps allay their fears. You bargain with them. First of all, you allay their fears that you know what you're doing. You don't make it forever. You just say, give me a shot. You get your aunts and uncles, a third party to support you, because you have to do that indirect thing, right? And so I'm like the surrogate Asian dad for everybody. Like Uncle Russell says I can do it, so maybe, so that I think that's what I tell my students, like, your parents are fearful and they're rightfully fearful. It's the unknown. They haven't seen other people do it. So you got to show and demonstrate why you think, do a PowerPoint presentation, just like you would sell anybody else. You can't just argue with them. And then you tell your story, just like how we have to tell our hearts, you share your heart, and maybe they'll empathize. I don't know if this works, but this is what I tell my students. I'm going to go on a long spiel here, so let me preach. Hurt people hurt others, right? Abuse people abuse others. Asian Americans experiencing racism will learn to be racist. Will become anti-white, will become anti-Black, or will become anti-Asian. We'll turn that anger directed towards us and we'll turn it inward. So we'll self-stigmatize. I know kids who haven't eaten Asian foods because the start of racism, the COVID-19 has made them so scared about being Asian, they want to avoid the Asian aspects of their lives. So we turn that racism inward, right? We're ashamed. We self-stigmatize. And so we as Asians are just going to perpetuate a system of violence and racism unless we deal with it, right? That's my fear. And then I think about, well, how do you break that cycle of violence, that cycle of racism that Asian Americans now are really potential to perpetuate ourselves? And I want to be healed myself. I don't want to turn my anger out on my family. I don't want to turn it inward or other people. And I've been reading about all these instances. And so how do you get healed then? And it's by flocking, it's by getting support, it's by sharing the stories, it's by connecting with people. That's my wife's a pediatrician who does trauma-informed care. She says those who face trauma need the support of caring individuals, caretakers. And that's what we all need at this time. Asian Americans are facing racism. We need the support of caring individuals to help us process it. And then my hope is that healed people heal others, right? And so Asian Americans now have the potential to come out of the pandemic if we deal with this pain, if we acknowledge it, if we tell our story. Don't go into fight or flight response, which just perpetuates the system. Flight response just denies it and will continue the system. But if we actually flock and get healed, then that's the opportunity we have to actually make a big difference, not only for Asians and protect Asians, but to change our society, right? That's a big opportunity. And so then as healed people, Asian Americans healing others, we hold the system accountable. We call for apologies, and then we call for reparations. That not only were we wronged, but our relationships need to be repaired. And so getting money isn't the point. Repairing our relationships with others is a whole notion of restorative justice, right? Of being transformed ourselves so that we don't become the perpetrators, so that the perpetrators develop empathies towards us and know what they've done wrong. So that we don't hold our resentment and anger forever, but we're able to forgive. So reparations helps us because it symbolizes that being able to let go. It symbolizes the acknowledgement that wrong was done. It symbolizes that we want to make repair. So it's not actually a money or an apology we want a restored relationship. So that's what reparations means to me. Reparations represent a restored relationship. And so I don't know, I think it would be really meaningful if people really apologized, if people really said that was wrong, if really people, if people really said, what can we do to make things better? That's reparation. I think that's a real apology. Because that's not real, change your behavior. Like, okay, that would be a real apology. And so in the same way, America can't just apologize. we can't just apologize to Blacks. We have to really seek to repair. So does that help? And so reparations represent a real effort to make change, to restore relationships that were broken, that were wounded. Thanks everyone for listening for so long. It's been a real fun discussion. Sorry if I'm so flippant, but no, getting representation is a serious matter. You know, getting into political office is really necessary. And so it's both, you know, I can only deal with the racial trauma with, hopefully with a sense of humor is a good way to respond rather than, with you, I could flock and I could joke about it, but it is a hard time and I'm thankful for people like you who come together. So thank you.